seminar on Islam and Biomedicine, a seminar series here supported by the Templeton Trust. So this week, after last week's, that is, we are looking at things a bit more with a philosophical and legal take on Maqasid and Biomedicine. We are indeed very fortunate to have with us, not so sure whether to call you a home team player or an away team player, but in fact you're both, Dr. Aasim Padela, who is listed here as coming from the University of Chicago, but in fact is a home teamer here as well. He is indeed presently spending his sabbatical here at the center as one of our visiting fellows. In fact, this is his second tour of duty here in Oxford, as he was here back in 2010 and couldn't get the best of us, or couldn't get enough of us, that is, when he was a visiting fellow then. Now, Dr. Aasim, my collaborator here, MD, so I just realized that, you see, when it comes to those with a medical degree, we need to make sure that we do say that. Actually, Dr. Aasim, MD, is the director of the Unit on Islam and Medicine, Associate Professor of Medicine in the section of Emergency Medicine, and a faculty member of the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at the University of Chicago. And indeed, from 2013 to 2015, he led a national survey in the US of Muslim physicians' bioethical attitudes and professional experiences. Dr. Padela's current projects span Muslim attitudes and behaviors related to cancer screening and, as we've seen from our first seminar, of course, for this series, end-of-life care, and the intersection of science and Islamic theology, and indeed at that intersection of science and Islamic theology and law for his project, all of which are funded by the Temple Foundation and the American Cancer Society. So for today, we'll be looking forward to hear him to speak about Maqasid. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, simply means the goals or objectives of the Islamic sacred legal tradition. So it can therefore tend to be both, as I mentioned earlier, philosophical and legal as well. And to look at that and its intersections really with the latest kind of sticky wickets, as people who like to watch cricket will say, issues that arise out of the field of biomedicine. So let us all give a warm welcome to Dr. Aasim, please.
Bismillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So Dr. Fifi and Dr. Nizami is not here. Thank you again for allowing me to come back and have a second tour of duty. I hope I won't be killed by the end of this tour, but and return safely. But I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to you all showing up here today for this continuing seminar series. And as Dr. Fifi mentioned, that we would like to acknowledge the funding from the John Templeton Foundation to host this series. So I'm going to talk a little about Maqasid and contemporary biomedicine, but before I do so, I want to give you a sense of sort of the work that I do in the collaborating that we're doing with the Initiative on Islamic Medicine that I lead at the University of Chicago. So our research resides at this intersection between the Islamic tradition, biomedicine, and Muslim practices. Particularly, we try to understand how Islam impacts the health behaviors of Muslim patients and how that leads to sort of cultural challenges in the hospital setting. We look at how Muslim physicians, and he mentioned a survey that I've done, but we think about how Islam informs their practices and how that leads to certain bioethical attitudes within the practice of medicine. And then we research these individuals who are a diverse class, but just think about them as Islamic scholars who have a biomedical imagination. Right? What does that consist of? How does that apply within their legal rulings? So we conduct theological, textual, and empirical research. Usually it's this way, right, from empirical to theological, but today I'm going to be presenting from the theological to the empirical. So with that said, our course for tonight is an appetizer. I will introduce to you to some of the concepts in terms of Maqasid al-Sharia. We're going to then have 3 main courses, very brief courses. You won't get your fill, but at least you'll get a taste. I'm going to detail 3 approaches for using Maqasid al-Sharia to furnish an Islamic bioethics. I want to talk about a model of the essential dimensions of human health based on Imam Shafi'i's writings and his Muwafaqat, who is the father, so to speak, of this genre. I'm going to then outline a health policy agenda based on the maqsad of Hifz al-Nafs, the preservation of life, which is one of the cardinal overarching sort of maqasid. Then in the end you will have some dessert with Dr. Talal providing some color commentary on what I present, and hopefully in the end we'll have some tea, which will be our discussion. So why the Maqasid al-Sharia? Well, this is a topic, or this is a genre that is of interest in many different corners. On one hand, you can think about applied scientists wanting to understand how Maqasid works, or this idea which is both a philosophy and a legal source for rulings. So how does that work? And can we think about that as a system to rejuvenate the rampant, quote-unquote, legalism within Islamic law? And I'll talk to you about what that means later on. You have individuals who would want to write about how maqasid, this notion of higher objectives or goals, informs our practices, right? So maqasid al-sunnah, the idea how do we think about the prophetic narrative, what were the objectives of what he was doing, how does that inform our daily practice as Muslims? Then you have individuals who think, well, let's take about this class or genre of thinking, maqasid al-sharia, and apply that to public policy. Right? So I'm going to speak a little bit about how that might inform health policy, but you have individuals and institutes who think about how can we use this corpus within the Islamic tradition and engage modernity in policy making through Maqasid al-Sharia. So why? Well, for one reason, Maqasid al-Sharia in a way is broad in scope. You can think of it as an Islamic axiology, how we think about theory, our theories of goods and values, right? What Islam is for, how does it think about bringing itself out into the lived world. We can think about science and scientists, right? These individuals are allowed to enter the domain, so to speak, of Islamic law because it moves beyond legalism and scriptural authority dominance. You have to think about how things are applied in society. So it's a genre that applied scientists, such as myself, are very interested for that purpose. It also allows largely this notion of projecting, quote unquote, again, Islamic values out into a plural, right, diverse world. There's no necessary need for scriptural anchors in the interfaith secular liberal dialogue based on maqasid. We think about protecting life. You can talk about protecting life without saying, well, I'm going to trace that back to a specific verse in the Quran. And then you can have dialogue with others and say, yeah, life is important to us. Now, what does life mean to you and what does it mean to me might be different, but it allows you to engage in a plural discourse. This notion of what I call reading out and not reading in. Oftentimes, and you see this slide here, and I apologize, the pointer doesn't work very well here. This genre, particularly science and Islam, which Dr. Fifi knows well and myself, people read outward in. They think about, well, the Quran talks about, some people, the Quran talks about, astronomy or predated black holes, and let's think about what's out there, read that into some Quranic text, right? But this genre reads outward. So what are the values contained within the scriptural sources? How do they project out into the world? So again, this is what makes it very interesting and engaging for people of diverse backgrounds. And I must say, Maqasid al-Sharia, although people think about this as a new phenomenon, it's not new. Right? Even Imam al-Shatibi, who I'll introduce in a few slides, talked about whether we should have a specific science of maqasid that's part of what people who become jurists learn. That they must start with thinking about this science of maqasid, not just fiqh. So it's something that occurred, way back when, but now we're sort of drawing upon it again. So what are the Maqasid al-Sharia? Well, if you think about Imam al-Shatibi, who again is the father of the field, so to speak, there are some traces backwards, but he's the one who sort of classified a particular science and sort of delineates the theory and framework for Maqasid al-Sharia. 13th century individual, Maliki jurist, in the sort of the western part, or I guess, the western part of the Muslim world. So he sort of wrote this definition in his text, Muwafiqat, which is the seminal text when people say Maqasid. He says, Usul al-Din wa Qawa'id al-Sharia wa Kulliyat al-Millah, right? So it is the fundamentals of the deen, of the religion. These represent the principles of the law and the essential universal beliefs of the faith. This is what the Maqasid Sharia are. And what we think about when we write about it, that these are the higher objectives or the overarching intents of Islamic law. The related idea is, okay, these are what maqasid are as a class, but it refers to a genre. And this genre of frameworks, right, for delineating moral norms, human interests, ethics, and policy based on these objectives. And oftentimes we talk about this in nazariyat and ilm al-maqasid, that this is what it is. It's both a specific thing, but also a genre. In the specific form, and I'm going to go through this in an exercise with you all probably the one time we have some engagement prior to the Q&A around what this can mean, what maqasid refer to. And they can refer to various different things depending on who you're reading and who they're writing to. So there's discipline-specific usage of the term with overlapping other constructs. One of them is this notion of the lawgiver's intents or wisdoms behind rulings, the hikmah. Right? The other is a specific rationale which alleges the illah behind a set of laws. Another term that's sometimes used as a stand-in for maqasid that they refer to the human interests, in this case the masalih, that the lawgiver affirms and therefore they come into Islamic law. So all of these three things can be referred to when a writer is writing the maqasid. And it's up to the person who's reading to figure out what is he referring to, in which context. So here's an example. Let's do that. Before I get the example, let me do this and go back. So let's think about the example where these terms come to play. So start with the notion that maqasid are contained within scriptural text, right? So you say, okay, well, where are there legislative sources within the scriptural text? What does the Quran or the Sunnah tell us to do? Here's an example. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ allowed for the shortening of prayers during travel. We have various narrations about this, practice and also saying. Similarly, the Quran in several verses talks about travelers are allowed to postpone fasting. So here's a law within Scripture, both scriptural sources, both of legislative authority. How do you understand what God wants from us, and how do we consider these sorts of laws? You use the terms of hikmah, illah, and masalih, right? So let me ask you, in a sense here, what do you think the reason, if you were to say, I need to understand why God is legislating, what is the reason for these allowances? And rukhas is an interesting topic in any way, but why does God allow for this to happen? Why is this legislation within the scriptural text? Ideas?
You're bringing the tea forward here a bit.
The one time I said. Why?
So it's my understanding that we're told that it's to make things easy and not to make things hard.
Okay. So God allows people to shorten their prayers when traveling, or to not fast or postpone fasting when traveling because he wants to avoid hardship. Yes? Okay. Humans should avoid hardship. What else? Any other thoughts?
Health reasons.
Sorry?
Health reasons.
What do you mean?
Obviously, in traveling, if there's a very intensive routine, obviously it's going to.
So there might be some harms that accrue in travel because of doing these things? Okay. So the jurist task, right, or the theologian jurist / task is to think about, well, what does God want, right? And how can we extend this ruling? So the first question becomes, well, what is the exact condition under which something is happening? If you think about this law, right, what is the condition of the human action? What's happening? What's the context? And that context allows you to extend rulings to other things. So one formation would be, okay, well, that's the illah, right, using our Islamic term, is being on travel. That is the trigger condition under which something is being allowed. So you think about the revelatory source, then you think about the context of what's happening when a law is being revealed. This is what's happening, or the condition, the context, being on travel. Then you say, okay, well, what is the sort of the human benefit behind that? And these were supposed to be staged, but I'm not so savvy in PowerPoint. In any case, what's the human interest, right, behind that? What's the benefit? Well, humans can worship. Worship is facilitated. Then the question becomes, now you move from revelatory source to the act, to the context of the act, the human benefit in the act. Well, why does God want that? You go back up to God, right? Well, what is the reason? And so you mentioned, remove hardships. Worship is facilitated at the human level. God's intent behind that might be to remove hardship from mankind. That's his fadl. That's coming out of his sort of magnanimity, his beneficence to mankind. From that, so this is all law. Jurist said, okay, if you think about all the laws that are in Islam, all the scriptural texts, how can we think about an overarching objective for all those things? What are the values behind those rulings? You come with a maqsad, right? So this is the overarching sort of bab, so to speak, of what is happening in these sorts of rulings. The notion is that we want to preserve or establish religion. That is the good, so to speak, that comes behind it. So for me, right, as a non-specialist or a literate individual in Islamic law, I find it very fascinating that you're mediating between the divine and earthly realms. That's what's happening, right? You're sort of thinking about, as I said, what happened? A ruling within Revelation, coming from an otherworldly sort of source, the context of the human act, the significance of the act upon the human, then why would God want to think about that or legislate that? What's the follow behind that? And then you come up with an objective for law, so they can make more laws for humanity. So this is the mediation that's occurring. So let me move back one slide for a second. So this is the process of coming up with the Maqasid al-Sharia. You have to discern rationale from the Quran or the Sunnah, or the prophetic canon. And for some jurists, they actually also look at the legal canon, the legal corpus, all of it together, right? And you develop theories of Maqasid. As I mentioned, the individual that most people trace these theories back to is Imam al-Shatibi, this 13th century Maliki jurist. His process, and as he says in his text, was an inductive method, istiqra', right? So he said particularly that, by looking at the overall inner spirit, right, we can understand how to extend law. That the problem was that when you look at the particulars, you get a specific section or specific insight, but not an overarching insight. So you had to look at all of the material. And for him, and this is an argued point by some later scholars, and the way he says it himself, that he wanted to look at particularly the legal punishments in the Makki Quran. That was what he wanted to look at. And you see there are a lot of hudud punishments, a lot of legal penalties for life within the Makki Quran. Those were then explained by the Madni Quran, the verse that came down in Medina, and then those are the general values, and then you look to Sunnah. So for him, the primary source was the Makki Quran. And particularly when God legislated that you can either give your life or take a life. That's how it started. He borrowed and built upon Imam al-Ghazali, his progenitor's hifz construction, the notion of preservation, which I will explain in a few slides. And then this real notion that Ghazali is known for, that he thinks the human interests correspond to objectives of the law. Right? This is a live debate between why does God legislate? Is it for man's benefit or something else? Right? Is law created for the man or the man for the law? This sort of debate occurs. Ghazali's notion was there's a correspondence here. Okay, so we did this. So continuing with al-Shatibi's sort of method and his theory, so that we can get to the applied science in a second, he enumerates these essential maqasid, right? The preservation of religion, life, progeny, wealth, and intellect. These are the 5 sort of overarching values. And when you think about a hierarchy, he suggests that the primary interest is religion, protection of religion, or preservation of religion, and then life. And for the rest, he doesn't have it. Right? So religion over life. Now this is another area, not today, that is a real debate. Whether life comes first or religion later, how does this work? Different scholars have different views. But important for us today, and the next slides I want to talk about, is that these are the essential ones, right? So you had this notion, does it come later? Here. I apologize somehow that the slides became out of order. But he says these are the essential ones, right? There's 3 classes of maqasid: essential, necessary, and enhancing. He enumerates the essential ones, which he defines as they establish the interests of life. Their absence leads to corruption and trials, as well as loss of life. And ultimately, Islamic law looks at afterlife ramifications. So you have loss of success in the hereafter. The haji are necessary ones. They facilitate, and particularly are for removing hardship. And then tahsini, these are perfect actions, inform etiquette, so on and so forth. He classifies these, talks about the daruri and what they are. The others, he leaves open. Right? Simply saying that the haji supplement the daruri, and the tahsini complement the haji. That as long as there is no loss of the daruri, these are to be specified in the future. How is that done? Well, either the secondary objectives, the necessary and the enhancing, are explicitly stated by scriptural sources. So you look again to the text. Or they're implicit, right? They're inferred because they're carried with the explicit sort of values, but they come to reinforce, strengthen, or support them. So now it's still based in the text. But here's where everybody has a field day. They're determined by reasoning about the benefits and harms and actions. And for him, he's a Maliki jurist, this was maslaha mursala, right? benefits for mankind that are not within the text, but I can be reasoned about. And other schools have their other modes. It's the Lad and the Shafis, whatever else, but the Hanafis, Ahlul Rai. So we have other views of how this occurs in different legal schools. The point being, you're a little bit unbounded now. You're outside of the scope necessarily of the scriptural sources, but you're bounded by them in the sense that you can't overturn something that's present there. Okay? Okay. That's the sort of the appetizer. I know is a heavy appetizer. This slide is just here to make you think about what other people say, that Maqasid Sharia sort of is related to the natural rights of man. I don't think this is exactly correct, but anyway, some people have written about this, right? About the rights of man, and some of the audience would know what that refers to. So now let's move to the sort of the main courses. As you know, I'm very interested in Islamic bioethics and what is Islamic about bioethics. And for some scholars, maqasid is what is Islamic about Islamic bioethics. You can bring the maqasid in to bioethics and it makes it Islamic. So let's talk about how they do that. So approach one that I characterize is what I call surface level theorization. Basically, you turn the essential maqasid that have been identified by Imam al-Shatibi into meta-level principles. And an individual does that, for example, is Umar Hassan Kasuli, who is a microbiologist, a physician, but is heavily involved in the Islamic fiqh academies and is presently in Saudi Arabia. So he says, for a medical issue to be ethical, it must fulfill or not violate one or more of the 5 purposes, the 5 maqasid. Right? And for him, he says that this is the hierarchy amongst them: religion, then life, proper progeny, intellect, wealth. Okay. So this approach really means it's a principlist approach. Right? It's one that supplants and complements what we often, in those who went to medical school, when we learned the conventional Georgetown mantra, the 4 principles: respect for autonomy, beneficence, maleficence, non-maleficence, and social justice. So for him, and his argument is that it supplants, you can get rid of that, or it complements what you would deduce from using those 4 principles and ethical and medical practice. And where I sort of characterize this as surface level theorization, he defines the interests, or he and other individuals like this define them with surface level theorization, what they mean through a medical lens. So religion becomes capacity for worship and performing meritorious deeds. This is what medicine is for, to help preserve religion in this way. Life, well, this is biopsychosocial health. All of medicine is about preserving life. Progeny becomes preserving the capacity for procreation. Intellect becomes mapped onto mental health, right? Psychological mental health. Wealth, societal wealth, resource allocation. So that's how they conduct their theorization about these maqasid. Let me give you a couple of examples. So in the reproductive health realm, let's talk about the hierarchy. So the question is posed, should spouses separate if one of them has AIDS? The answer, based on this theory, would be yes, because life is more important than progeny. Right? The point of having a marriage is to be able to have children, maybe, so there you go, it's done. Thinking about the principles in usage, is reproductive cloning permissible? The answer is no, because preservation of religion entails also preservation of God as having dominion over life and death. So cloning would create new life in a way that's not natural, therefore it's not permissible. Similarly, is permanent sterilization permissible? No, because it directly contradicts preservation of progeny in this way. Okay. A critique would be, well, these interests, right, religion, life, progeny, intellect, wealth, are defined without recourse to scripture, right? Relatively unbounded, and they're relativistic. Right? Who defines them? How do you use them? I would argue this also neglects the entire category of secondary objectives, the necessary and the enhancing. This is just the essential ones. And then really, this is what's problematic for me. We can talk about this all night if you'd like. That health becomes the ultimate human interest. Right? That there is no such thing as religious interest prioritizing over health interests. But truly, is health the ultimate objective of life? Can people, right, is that what we need to do? That for me is a problem. Sometimes, for example, we might absorb, or people might absorb, a hit to their health because of a religious purpose. Going on a journey, fasting during Ramadan, or for some people who are diabetics, right? You might absorb that for some other religious end. So for me, this is problematic when you make health the ultimate end in the religious scale. The second approach is conceptual extension. So here, maqasid are sort of are turned into sort of maqasid are expanded. So they become delineated from different, not just the scriptural source texts, but other texts. So for example, Gawadi al-Qiyab talks about that you should look at the divine laws of creation and definitive facts of science. They can be sources for new maqasid themselves. Tariq Ramadan talks about adding natural theology and natural ends, and I'll provide a slide in a second. So through this sort of construction or reconstruction, maqasid become a deontological framework for biomedicine. They lead to duties. What is conceptual extension? Well, this is what it looks like. So life, hifz and nafs, becomes right to life and sanctity of body, and he actually says in English law. So all of a sudden, all of English law about right to life and sanctity of body becomes incorporated into the Islamic legal paradigm. Tariq Ramadan talks about a more amorphous concept of human dignity. So we should preserve human dignity. That is what preservation of life entails. Religion becomes protect the Islamic conception of life and death. So he's not here. We can talk about that. But so the point, however, is this is what's occurring. Now you have the revealed text, scriptural sources, and you say they are on the same playing field, level playing field with the book, quote unquote, of the universe. This is a slide from Tariq's book. Textual sciences, context sciences. You become, this is how you get at the end maqasid sharia. You look at both of these sources, delineate new maqasid, leads to a new applied ethics, which is maqasid sharia. And in his initial sort of formulation, these are the new maqasid that emerge. You start out with global conception of life and death, which is deen, right? Hifz of deen. You have maslaha, which is human benefit in different terms and theologically and legally. But in any case, you start with those. You now think about protecting life, nature, and peace. And then you kind of think about rulings in the inner being, the individual, and societies and groups. So you've now expanded fully, right, the corpus of Islamic law. Let's look at an example in bioethics. So end-of-life care, right? Is physician-assisted suicide permissible? The answer would be based on this rubric, no. There's an Islamic duty to preserve the traditional conception of life and death, right? It's in God's jurisdiction. And also there's a mandate or a duty to preserve life. So both preservation of religion, preservation of life lead to duties that would say that you can't do this. What is the moral status of advanced life support? So here you say, well, it's optional. How? Because using all curative means, right? This is what people usually say, I want everything done, coheres with the duty to preserve human dignity. Remember, that's the reconstruction from life to dignity. But not seeking also coheres with the traditional conception of life and death, being under God's dominion. So you have a conflict between religion and life. He's equivocal where it goes. What's more important, religion or life? So you say both are okay, it's optional. A principal critique I would offer is that this presents an epistemic quandary. The revealed text and the natural theology, a big issue, right? So let's take an example. You have an individual, or two examples. An individual who's born congenitally deaf. He has ears, or she has ears, but they don't sense, they don't hear. Is the responsibility for us as practitioners, or for medicine in general, to now restore that, enhance that? Person was born congenitally deaf, right? Or similarly, a person does not have a capability biologically to have children. This is a hot topic now with individuals, for example, who have the same sex, right? They can't procreate. Is it our responsibility to create synthetic gametes, which we can do, so they can have children, right? Where does this come in? Where's the natural end of the human being of the body? So this becomes a quandary, at least in my reading of this sort of approach. Approach 3, so what I term text-based postulation. So this would involve explicating the visions of health and flourishing that are embedded within al-Shatibi's essential objectives. Again, he only enumerates the essential ones, so you have to sit there. These visions then of life set minimal end goals for biomedicine, and then secondary objectives are added based on biomedical science and move from producing the essential conditions of life to a flourishing humanity. So what does this mean? And I'll show you in the next 2 courses of this meal. But the essentials of preserving life involve production, maintenance, and production of life. This is sometimes left out, but this is called, wujudi, hifz wujudi, and hifz adami, right? So you would protect in its existence, and then you protect against its extermination. So this is production and protection. Maintenance is incorporated in between. But what does it mean for here, this preservation of life through his own writing? Well, you have to legitimate procreation, right? That's production of life. Life can't be produced without legitimating procreation in a certain way. You can't maintain life without provision of food. And you can't protect life, right? It would be at a universal loss if you don't provide shelter and clothing. So that's how he explicates it. More to come. So this provides a general moral framework for healthcare structuring, in my view, right? You can incorporate social determinants of health, something I will describe in a few moments, along with clinical care, right? The vision of protection of life, again, hifz and nafs here, extends out to other aspects of life, not just providing clinical care. You can address and create policies for addressing the leading causes of mortality. If you're talking about preserving life, well, what does science tell us about what are the things that cause death in society? And we should create policies there, both of which I'll describe in moments. But the limitation here clearly is that it remains, this sort of approach will remain wedded to one particular theoretician's scripture-based conceptualization of the interests. You're just there, you're just staying with his theory, how he outlined them. Yet the benefit is he was truly scripturally driven. He stays there, doesn't want to move beyond. There's also this larger problem for a moral framework, right, of ends and means. So does the philosophy of ends lead to an ethics of the means to do that or not? How so? Where are the contradictions? Okay, course 1. Course 2. So let me illustrate this. So the essential dimensions of human health based on Shalaby's sort of model. So the method I've sort of outlined, but you would analyze the elements and means for preserving life, this hifz and nafs, right, and in this case, the intellect as well. Okay, that's related to the human body. And you would look at specifically the Maqasid. Recall, these are ones that establish the interests of life, their absence leads to corruption and trials, as well as loss of life and then loss of success in hereafter. And as I mentioned, hifz entails 2 obligations in a universal sense, right? So this is about universal general mankind. So you have to establish the interest, right, the existence of the interest, and then you have to defend against its negation. So what does Shalaby say? Well, within the preservation of life, he talks about, and I mentioned some of this, but I'll give you a fuller explanation here. He says you have to establish life, or you could establish life, by legitimating boundaries of procreation. He says this is actually within the text of the Quran and the Sunnah. You find this, right? For all of these, that's what he says. Again, he's bounded within the text. You have to provide food and drink. We have many hadith that talk about this. You have to provide clothing and shelter. So that's securing, right? Establishing, sustaining, and securing life. Underneath that, there's an education modality. You all know a lot of hadith that talk about the primary purpose of revelation is to educate mankind, or one of them, or the Sunnah is to do so. So he talks about educating people about the rules of marriage, divorce, and illicit relations. Again, educating individuals about, staying away from harmful food and drink. And then you have to now criminalize the taking of life. So this is all part of the essential maqsad here. The preservation of intellect, establishing it, well, God gives you intellect. Some people he doesn't. So you don't establish it yourself. Yet you can sustain it by refraining from intoxicants, again, finding scriptural text and evidence for that, and you can criminalize intoxicants. That's how you secure it. So that's his view of how you preserve life and preserve intellect. A vision for human health. What does that vision look like? So that would mean that you have to provide a minimal notion, right? A minimalist notion. You have to cover the awra of men and women. That's enough clothing to sustain falls out of preserving life. That's the minimal amount that you need. Right? And the awra is an Islamic concept of where you have to cover, but in any case, that's the minimal clothing that needs to be provided. You have to have some minimal notion of protection from the elements. Maybe even just that, right? So that you're not going to be swept away by a windstorm, or the rain's not going to cause you to drown. But some minimalist notion of shelter. You have to have some establishment maintain a procreative capacity, because that's how life will be produced after you, right? So you have to maintain that. If it's harmed, you have to protect it, or you have to restore it, and then you should stay away from intoxicants. That would get rid of aqad, so to speak. That's the minimalist notion of health based on the Maqasid of Sharia of Imam al-Shatibi. Now, as I said, to me this sounds a lot like something I know from medicine, which are called the social determinants of health. If you think about the determinants of health in society, what produces health, right? What helps society live longer, we classify it in this way. That individuals, and there are several different constructions, all data-driven, by the way, that a person's health is dependent upon 10% their genes and biology, right, your genetic makeup, another 10% their physical environment, another 10% when you go to the hospital, what they do there, say 10%. 30% on what you do outside of your health behaviors, what sort of risky behaviors you take, or do you drive at 150 miles an hour, so to speak? Do you smoke, right? Do you involve yourself in risky activities? And then a lot of it, or the majority of it, is social and economic status. You want to improve someone's lifespan, so to speak? Give them wealth and education. That's it. That's how you will improve lifespan. None of this stuff actually really matters compared to that. That is the majority of it. So, which is why you live in an NHS sort of construct, and in the States, we care about other things. So that's how it works, right? So now, if you think about this, and what I just presented to you about Imam Shafi'i's framework for protection of life, you see some inklings here, right? He talks about procreative capacity, producing life. He talks about protecting from taking of life, the social environment, right? Criminalizing taking of life. Talks about protection from the elements, physical environment. Talks about educating people about bad foods, what's harmful to you, right? How do you procreate, these sorts of things, educational literacy. And he talks about sort of the notion of, here, he talks about, what is it? Actually, why did I put that there? I don't know. He doesn't talk about money. So in any case, he talks about these sorts of things, which are part and parcel of the determinants of health that we know, and actually more important, if you add them, than the clinical hospital down the road for societal health. Okay, so here the implication is that such an evaluation of Islamic bioethics through the Maqasid approach would set policies for healthcare structuring. It provides a philosophy of healthcare. You move from lawgivers' intents to human interests, then that leads to a holistic vision for human health, and that becomes an ethical mandate, producing that in society. And then there are this notion that such a system would be open, right? It would be adaptable to social contexts. We know this data now. It can change tomorrow, and that would be open to changing how we think about structuring healthcare. And here, as I said, the epistemic authority is given to scientific rationale in a sense, right? There's specification of old or identification of new maqasid or secondary maqasid. All right, so final course before dessert. So how would this, and you already see the inklings here, how would this produce health policy? Let me give you an example. So, you can derive a health policy agenda by building out, right? You're building out from the preservation of life because he himself and the theories of Maqasid allow science to add secondary, right, necessary enhancing objectives, particularly as long as they align with the scriptural sort of primary ones, right, the essential ones. But these are unspecified. Yeah. So you have the essential specified, and you specify the necessary enhancing. You can think about it in this way, right? This comes above. This gone, you lose mankind. Above them, you enhance mankind, or you sort of embellish upon that. Or you can think about it as a circle, right? That you have the essential ones specified, you build outwards into necessary enhancing through policy, law, and ethics. So an example would be, let's think about the top 10 causes of death, right? So we said preserve life. Well, what do we know? What does science tell us about, death? How does death occur? And what are the disease states that cause that? We know globally, here's an example to talk about, but of the causes of death, right, ischemic heart, this is, again, the slide cut off, but ischemic heart disease is the number one cause. Stroke, you all know these things in a second, but look at 3 and 4. Chronic obstructive disease and tracheal and bronchial cancer. Right, this is 3 and 4. If you think about the UK, lung cancer is number 5 here. Okay. Now, what do we know about what causes or what is associated with onset of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer? Well, we know smoking causes that, or is a high. There are many risk factors, but smoking is clearly associated. So you tackle lung cancer, COPD deaths through an Islamic quote-unquote policy initiative. We know, right, that there is benefit in reduction in smoking by levying taxes on tobacco products. The behavioral science is clear. We know that we can regulate advertising, particularly for underage children, so they develop smoking habits. Proven. We know that we can educate individuals in school, clinical, and community settings about the harms of smoking. This has some benefit. Marginal, but some benefit. So scientifically, all of these strategies have a greater than 50% certitude of reducing smoking behavior in society. Right? And that's the category, غلبة الظن, within Islamic sort of legal mechanisms, right? You need to be above wahm, above shak. You need to be above you need to have greater than 50% certitude. This is actually our legal corpus is based on this. So here you now append legal certainty upon biomedical certainty, statistical certainty here. So you would then produce an authentic, quote-unquote, Islamic agenda linked to scripture, but developed without scriptural literalism. The word is not there. Okay, that's it. That's the 3-course meal. I told you would get a taste, but not full, and hopefully now we'll have some dessert.